Alright, so I don't usually post stuff like this, but I've been sitting on this for a while and I need to get it off my chest. If you're looking for some moral lesson at the end of this story, you're not going to find it. I messed up bad. And now, well, let's just say, I can't go back. This all started about a year ago. I was broke as hell, man. I dropped out of college after just 2 semesters because the debt was suffocating me. I had no job, no savings, just drowning in bills. The student loans were piling up, rent was due, and my parents had already given up on me. I was a deadbeat in their eyes. Every time I called them, it was just the same conversation. Get your shit together. Like, that's easy, right? Anyway, one night I was browsing Reddit looking for side hustles, Uber driving, DoorDash, all that crap, but none of it paid enough to even put a dent in my debt. That's when I saw this post in a deep web forum I'd stumbled onto a few weeks prior. It was about selling blood, not donating, selling. And I'm not talking about your standard plasma donations, where you go to some dingy clinic and they give you $50 and a cookie. This was some dark web shit. Anonymous buyers were paying insane amounts for blood. I'm talking a couple hundred per pint. That's more money than I'd seen in months. I had healthy blood, no drugs, no diseases, so I figured, why not? I spent a few days thinking it over. I mean, what was the worst that could happen? I'd donate blood before. I wasn't going to die from giving a pint. Plus, the money would cover my rent and then some. So I did it. I signed up through some sketchy as hell site that I found after hours of clicking through weird links. The instructions were simple. Meet up at this specific location, a medical van would be there, and I'd get cash in hand right after they took the blood. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds shady as fuck, and believe me, I knew. But when you're desperate, your brain shuts off all the alarms. You just see dollar signs. The first time was, alright, they told me to meet in a parking lot of an abandoned strip mall. It was late at night, around 2 a.m. I parked my car and sat there, debating whether to go through with it. But then this white van pulled up. No windows, just like something out of a horror movie. A guy stepped out, dressed in scrubs, wearing a surgical mask. He waved me over. It was weird, sure, but he seemed professional enough. He had a clipboard and everything, asked me some basic medical questions. We didn't exchange names, he didn't even ask for my ID, just verified I was healthy. Next thing I knew, I was inside the van, lying on this old leather gurney while he prepped a needle. I tried to ask him how this all worked, like who exactly was buying this blood, but he just told me not to worry about it, said it was for private collectors. He stuck me with the needle, and I remember watching the blood slowly fill up the bags. It was kind of surreal, but whatever. The guy handed me $400 in cash afterward, told me I could come back in 2 weeks if I wanted. $400, I mean, holy shit. For like an hour of my time, I was hooked. The next 2 months, I went back every 2 weeks like clockwork, same process every time. The van, the masked guy, the needle, cash in hand. I didn't ask questions and they didn't give answers, but around the 3rd month something changed. One night the guy didn't show up. I waited in the parking lot for almost an hour, but nothing. I was about to leave when I got a text from a random number. It just said, location change, follow the map. A link was attached. Now again, this is where any normal person would have noped the fuck out, but I wasn't thinking straight. I was broke, addicted to that easy cash. And at this point, I didn't care how sketchy it got. The new location wasn't far, just a few blocks over, in an industrial area. I pulled up and immediately felt something was off. The van was there, but the lights were off. It was parked behind this huge abandoned factory, and there were no streetlights around, just pitch black except for my car's headlights. I almost turned around, but before I could, 2 guys stepped out from the shadows. Both of them were wearing those same surgical masks, but they weren't in scrubs this time. They were in street clothes, hoodies and jeans. Something about them made my stomach drop. They didn't say anything, just motioned for me to get out of the car. My whole body was screaming at me to leave, but like I said, I was desperate. I got out, and one of them grabbed my arm, a little too rough, and led me to the back of the van. Inside, there was no gurney this time. Just a dirty folding chair, a stained tarp on the floor, and what looked like Restraints. I froze. The guy holding my arm shoved me into the chair and strapped my wrists down with these old leather belts. I tried to ask what the hell was going on, but before I could finish the sentence, the other guy jammed a needle into my arm. That's when things went black. When I woke up, I was in my car, parked in a different lot. It was daylight and I had no memory of what happened after they drugged me. My arm was sore, and when I pulled up my sleeve, I saw bruises all over. I freaked out and checked my other arm. Same thing, bruises, needle marks. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, but like I'd been drained dry. I looked in the back seat and saw an envelope. Inside was $1,000 cash. At first I was relieved the money was there. I was alive, but then I started to notice the scars. Little cuts all over my arms, my chest, like someone had, I don't know, harvested something from me. It wasn't just blood, they'd taken more. And then there were the flashes, brief, disjointed images that kept popping into my head. Surgical lights, metal instruments, voices, but they weren't speaking English, something else. I couldn't piece it together, but every time I tried to focus on it, my head would pound like I was having a migraine. That was the last time I sold my blood, or at least I thought it was. So after that last drop-off, I told myself I was done. No more late-night parking lots, no more sketchy-ass vans. I wasn't about to end up in a body bag, and I sure as hell wasn't going to risk waking up missing a kidney or something. The $1,000 was a lot, yeah, but was it worth almost dying for? Hell no. But then, things started getting weirder. I figured after a few days I'd start feeling normal again, you know, after being drugged and whatever else they did to me. But I didn't. The bruises on my arms were healing, but I was still exhausted all the time, like no matter how much I slept, I couldn't shake this heavy, dragging feeling. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing with no idea why. And then there were the dreams. These weren't just nightmares. They were vivid, so real that I'd wake up and swear I was still trapped in them. In the dreams, I wasn't in my bed. I wasn't even in my house. I was strapped down, just like in the van, but this time I was on some kind of metal table. I couldn't move. There were figures around me, wearing those same surgical masks, but their eyes weren't human. They were black, completely black, like the eyes of a shark, and they were cutting me open, piece by piece, like I was nothing more than a piece of meat. The worst part, I could feel everything, the slicing, the pulling, the ripping, but I couldn't scream. I couldn't even close my eyes.
Every night, it was the same dream, and every night it got more detailed. They'd pull out different parts of me, like they were studying me. My organs, my muscles. Sometimes they'd hold them up to the light, like they were checking for defects. Other times they'd just toss pieces of me aside, like they didn't need them. And the pain, God, the pain. I would wake up in a panic, clutching my chest or my arms, certain that I'd been ripped open again. But there was nothing, just those fading bruises. I tried to brush it off as just nightmares, a side effect of whatever drug they'd used on me that night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. I could feel something was off. It was like my body wasn't mine anymore. Then things started happening when I was awake. A week after that last encounter, I was standing in front of the mirror brushing my teeth. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? But as I looked up, I noticed something in the reflection. My skin. It wasn't just pale from being tired. It looked different. Thinner, almost translucent, like if I pressed too hard, I could tear it open. And then, under the surface, I could see these faint, dark lines. Veins? No, it was like something was moving under my skin. I freaked out and splashed water on my face, trying to convince myself I was just imagining it. But the more I stared, the more I saw. Little ripples under my skin, like worms crawling beneath the surface. I panicked, grabbed my phone, and dialed a buddy of mine who worked at a clinic downtown. Told him I needed to come in, get some tests done. Maybe I'd contracted something from those guys. Maybe I was poisoned. I didn't know. When I got to the clinic, they ran the usual tests. Blood work, scans, the whole 9 yards. My buddy, Jake, looked worried, but he tried to play it cool. "You're probably just overtired, man," he said. but the way his eyes lingered on my arms told me he didn't believe his own words. He said he'd call me when the results came in.
The next day I got the call. Jake told me my blood work was off. Something about my white blood cell count being through the roof, like my body was fighting off a massive infection, but there were no other signs of illness. He said it was like my body had been invaded by something foreign, but they couldn't figure out what it was. The scans didn't show any infections or tumors, but my organs looked like they were deteriorating, like they were aging at an accelerated rate. I was in my mid-20s, but he said my liver, my kidneys, even my heart looked like they belonged to someone decades older. He wanted me to come back in for more tests, maybe even a biopsy, but I never made it. Because that night, things took a turn for the worst. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep despite the nightmares that I knew were waiting for me. But then, that same crawling sensation came back. Only this time, it wasn't just under my skin. I could feel it deeper, inside me, like something was moving through my veins. I sat up, turned on the lamp, and pulled up my shirt, and I swear to God, I almost passed out. There were bulges, small, moving lumps, traveling under my skin. They weren't just veins. They were like parasites, worming their way through my arms, my chest, even my legs. I could feel them moving, slow and deliberate, like they were trying to reach something. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Jake, but my hands were shaking too bad. I dropped the phone and just stared in horror as those things moved faster, and then they stopped. Everything went still. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but the bulges had disappeared. Just gone. I stood up, stumbling toward the bathroom, desperate to see if it was all in my head. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw it. My reflection, it wasn't me. It was like a delayed image, moving slower than I was. I raised my hand, and it raised its hand a second later. My face, though, it was distorted, stretched, and those eyes, black, just like in the dreams. My body wasn't mine anymore. Something else was using it. Something had gotten inside me that night in the van, and now it was trying to take over. I screamed. I don't know why, but I screamed like a maniac, punching the mirror, smashing it to pieces. My knuckles were bleeding, but I didn't care. The reflection was still there, staring back at me with those dead black eyes. And then I passed out. When I woke up, I was on my bathroom floor, surrounded by broken glass. My phone was buzzing next to me. I grabbed it, hands still trembling. It was Jake. I almost didn't answer, but I had to know what the hell was going on. When I picked up, his voice was shaky. He told me he'd gone over my blood work again and found something unnatural. He didn't have a name for it, but he said there were strange cells in my blood, cells that didn't belong to any known species. They were multiplying fast, like a virus. He said whatever they did to me that night, it wasn't just blood they took. They'd put something inside me, something that was changing me from the inside out. Jake begged me to come in, said I needed to get to a hospital immediately. But I knew it was already too late. I could feel it. Whatever they'd put in me had already spread too far. I hung up the phone and stared at the shattered pieces of the mirror, watching as my reflection slowly, deliberately smiled back at me. I didn't sleep after that. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel them moving again, not just under my skin, but deep inside my chest, my gut, like whatever they'd put in me was spreading, growing. I didn't know what the hell it was, but I knew one thing: it wasn't stopping. I didn't go to the hospital like Jake begged me to. What was the point? I wasn't even sure if I was human anymore. All I knew was that going anywhere public, where doctors could see what was happening to me, was a death sentence. They'd lock me up, strap me down, and run experiments on me. And honestly, after what I'd seen in my reflection, I didn't trust anyone with my body anymore. Not doctors, not Jake, not even myself. For the next few days, I holed up in my apartment, keeping the lights off, ignoring my phone. I didn't go to work, didn't talk to anyone. I just watched. Every movement under my skin, every twitch. It wasn't just random anymore. It was like those things inside me were figuring out how to move me, like they were testing the limits of my body. The worst part was that sometimes I'd lose control. I'd be walking to the kitchen or lying on the couch, and all of a sudden my arm would jerk out on its own. My leg would spasm. At first I thought it was just muscle twitches, but then it got worse. Whole chunks of time started disappearing. I'd blink, and the next thing I knew, I was standing in the middle of the room, hours later, with no memory of how I got there. It was like something else was piloting me. One night, it got really bad. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to stay awake, when I felt it again. The crawling. But this time, it wasn't under my skin. It was in my head. I shot up, clutching my temples as this overwhelming pressure built up behind my eyes. It felt like my skull was about to split open. I stumbled to the bathroom, panting, and when I looked in the mirror, it was worse than before. My face was moving, not just twitching, but shifting. The skin around my eyes was pulling back, tight like it was being stretched from the inside. My eyes, those dark, black voids, were staring back at me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't blink, couldn't scream. It was like something had hijacked my body, trapping me inside it. And then it smiled. I swear to God, I didn't make that expression. My mouth just stretched wide, teeth bared in this sick, twisted grin that didn't feel like mine at all. I was standing there, grinning like a maniac, and all I could do was watch. I wasn't in control anymore. My body started to move on its own. I backed up from the mirror, slowly, methodically, my arms swaying in this eerie, unnatural way. My legs moved stiffly, like a puppet on strings. My brain was screaming, begging for my limbs to stop, but I couldn't do a damn thing. I stumbled out of the bathroom, my face still locked in that grin, and walked straight to the kitchen. The next part, God, I don't even want to write this down, but I need to. People need to know. I went to the kitchen drawer, the one where I kept all my knives. My hand moved on its own, grabbing the biggest one, a long, sharp butcher knife. I could feel the weight of it in my palm, but it wasn't me holding it. It wasn't me lifting it up to my arm, and that's when I realized what was happening. Those things inside me, they were testing me, testing how much control they had over my body, how much they could make me do before I fought back, and they didn't care if I hurt myself in the process. The knife hovered just above my forearm, the blade pressing lightly into my skin. I could feel the cold steel biting into the flesh, and my mind was screaming at me to stop, to drop the knife, to do anything to get control back. But my arm didn't budge. I watched in horror as my hand slowly dragged the blade across my skin, a shallow, deliberate slice. The pain hit immediately, but it wasn't the kind of pain you expect. It wasn't sharp. It was dull, like the nerves in my arm had been numbed. Blood welled up from the cut, but I didn't feel it, not like I should have. I dropped the knife, finally, my hand twitching violently as I regained control. I stumbled backward, clutching my arm, watching the blood drip onto the floor. The wound wasn't deep, but it was enough to send me into full panic mode. What the hell had I just done? No, what the hell had they made me do? I wrapped a towel around my arm and sat there on the floor, shaking, blood soaking through the cloth. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't catch my breath. I knew right then and there, I was losing control. Over the next few days, it got worse. I started waking up with more cuts, more bruises, like I'd been attacking myself in my sleep. I'd find things in my apartment moved around, furniture pushed over, drawers open. One morning I woke up to find the front door wide open, the deadbolt shattered, like I'd kicked it open from the inside. I had no memory of doing any of it. And then, the people came. It was a Wednesday night when I heard the first knock. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was sitting in the dark, watching the TV on mute, trying to stay calm. When the knock came, it wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic tapping. I froze, heart racing. I wasn't expecting anyone, and no one in their right mind would come to my apartment at this hour. The tapping continued, more insistent now, like whoever it was knew I was inside. I crept toward the door, my mind racing with all kinds of paranoid thoughts. What if it was the guys from the van? What if they'd come to finish the job? Or worse, what if they'd come to collect me? I looked through the peephole and my blood went cold. There were two people standing outside, just barely visible in the dim hallway light. They were wearing the same surgical masks, the same ones from the van, but their clothes, they weren't scrubs. They were dressed in dirty, tattered clothes, like they'd been living on the street for years. Their eyes, though, that's what got me. Their eyes were jet black, just like mine had been in the mirror. I backed away from the door, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the lock. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. I thought maybe they'd left. Maybe they'd realized I wasn't going to open the door. But then I heard it. This low, guttural whisper coming from the other side. "We know what's inside you." The voice was raspy, inhuman, like it was scraping its way up from the depths of some dark pit. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching my bleeding arm, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't fight them off. Suddenly, the door rattled, hard, like someone was slamming their body against it. The frame creaked, and I could see the wood splintering around the lock. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it. The door burst open with a loud crack, and the two figures stepped inside. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they weren't fully in control of their bodies. Their heads twitched, their limbs spasmed, but their eyes, those dead, black eyes, never left mine. They didn't say anything else. They just stood there, staring, like they were waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. But I couldn't. My body was frozen. And then I felt it. The things inside me, stirring again. My arm twitched, the knife slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. The pressure in my skull returned harder this time, like something was forcing its way out. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sound of them whispering, over and over again, "We know what's inside you." When I woke up, I wasn't in my apartment. I was somewhere else, somewhere cold, dark, and damp. My head was pounding, and the sharp smell of rust and mold filled my nose. At first, everything was blurry, like I'd just come out of anesthesia, and my body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. I couldn't move. My arms and legs were heavy, like they didn't belong to me anymore. Then, the reality of where I was hit me like a brick. I was strapped to a metal table, my wrists and ankles bound with thick leather restraints. My chest felt tight, like there was a weight pressing down on it. Above me, a single dim light flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with this metallic smell, like blood, and I could hear the slow, steady drip of something leaking in the distance. The room was concrete, old, like the basement of some abandoned building, and there were tools, scalpels, saws, syringes, laid out on a tray next to the table. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. All that came out was a weak, hoarse croak. I struggled against the restraints, but they didn't budge. Panic set in and my heart started racing, but then I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, getting closer. I turned my head as much as I could, straining against the straps, and saw someone step out of the shadows. It was one of them, the people from my apartment. The same dirty clothes, the same black empty eyes. But this time, they weren't wearing a mask. Their face was off, pale, with these deep sunken cheeks and a thin, crooked smile. Their skin looked almost translucent, veins visible underneath, and their lips were cracked and dry like they hadn't had water in days. But it was their eyes, their empty, hollow eyes, that scared me the most. They weren't human, not anymore. The person, if you could even call them that, walked over to the tray of tools, picking up a scalpel and turning it over in their hands, examining it with this strange fascination. They didn't look at me. didn't acknowledge that I was even there. They just stood there, slowly turning the blade, their fingers trembling slightly, like they were barely holding it together. I wanted to scream, to demand to know where I was, what they were going to do to me, but my voice was gone. My throat was closing up, the fear so intense that I could barely breathe. I tugged at the straps again, desperate to get free, but it was no use. Then they finally spoke. "You weren't supposed to survive." Their voice was low, raspy, like gravel grinding against metal. They still didn't look at me, just kept fiddling with the scalpel, twirling it between their fingers. My mind was racing. What did they mean I wasn't supposed to survive? What the hell had they done to me? I managed to rasp out a single word. "Why?" The person stopped, their hand freezing mid-twirl, and finally they turned to look at me. Their eyes were completely black, no whites, no pupils, just voids. Empty, endless voids. They stepped closer, leaning over me, and I could see now just how unnatural they were. Their skin looked like it had been stretched too thin over their bones, like it didn't fit right. And their breath, it reeked of something rotten, like decaying meat. "You were just the beginning," they whispered, leaning down so close that I could feel their breath on my face. "We put it in you to see if it would take, to see if you could become one of us." I could barely process what they were saying. One of them? What the hell were they talking about? I wasn't like them. I was still me. I hadn't changed. At least, I didn't think I had. But then the flashes started. Brief images, disjointed, like memories that didn't belong to me. I saw myself walking through the streets at night, but it wasn't me in control. I saw the people in the van, saw them injecting something into my veins. I saw the black-eyed figures standing over me, whispering in a language I didn't understand. And then, I saw something else. I saw what was inside me. Whatever they'd put in me that night, it wasn't human. It wasn't a virus or a parasite. It was something alive, something sentient. It had been growing, spreading, taking over my body piece by piece, and soon it would take over my mind too. I could feel it now, moving inside me like a second heartbeat, a cold, slithering presence that was worming its way through my veins, my muscles, my brain. The person standing over me smiled that crooked, broken smile again and set the scalpel down. They reached out, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, and I felt an overwhelming surge of disgust. Their touch was wrong. Everything about them was wrong.
"You're changing," they said softly, almost like they were comforting me. "Soon you'll be like us. You won't need to fight it anymore. You'll see, this body, this life, it was never really yours." I started to shake, tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't want this. I didn't want to become one of them. Whatever the hell they were, I wasn't going to let them take me. I wasn't going to lose myself to whatever was crawling around inside me. "I'm not like you," I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The person tilted their head like they were confused by my resistance. Then they reached down and unstrapped one of my arms, freeing it from the leather restraints. I should have been relieved, but I wasn't. My arm, my own arm, felt foreign, like it wasn't even mine anymore. I could see the veins pulsing, the dark lines crawling up under the skin, and the sensation of movement, constant, writhing movement, was driving me insane. "Go ahead," they said, stepping back. "See for yourself." I didn't understand what they meant at first. My hand felt heavy, almost numb. But then I realized what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to look, to see what was really happening inside me. With trembling fingers, I reached up to my forearm, to the spot where I'd seen the veins shifting and moving before. The skin was thin there, almost translucent, and as I pressed down with my fingertips, I felt something squirm beneath the surface. I recoiled in horror, my stomach lurching, but my body moved on its own. My hand reached up again, and this time my fingers dug into my flesh. I gasped in pain, but I couldn't stop. I dug my nails deeper into my arm, pulling at the skin, feeling the warm blood start to pool under my fingernails. And then, with a sickening tear, the skin gave way. Underneath, I could see them.
Dozens, maybe hundreds, of tiny black worms writhing and coiling inside my flesh. They weren't just under the surface, they were everywhere, crawling through my veins, my muscles, twisting around my bones. I could feel them, now more than ever, moving with purpose. They were in control now, not me. I screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound that tore through my throat, but the person standing over me didn't flinch. They just watched, their head tilted, like they were studying me, like I was some kind of experiment. "You see now," they whispered. "It's too late." I slammed my head back against the table, trying to focus, trying to get control, but my body wouldn't listen to me anymore. My arm, the one I had just ripped open, was moving on its own, twitching and spasming like it was being pulled by invisible strings. The worms inside were burrowing deeper, faster, spreading into every part of me. I was losing myself, piece by piece, minute by minute. "Please, stop," I begged, tears streaming down my face, but the person just shook their head. "You were never meant to be saved," they said quietly. "You're one of us now. You'll see. Once you've fully changed, you'll understand. You'll be free." I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to be free in whatever twisted way they meant. I wanted my body back. I wanted my mind back. But it was slipping away, faster and faster. The worms, the things inside me, were taking over. And soon, there would be nothing left of who I was. The person stepped back into the shadows, leaving me alone in that cold, damp room, strapped to the table with my own body betraying me. And as I lay there, feeling the last bits of control slip away, I realized something. I wasn't alone anymore. Not in my body. Not in my mind. They were inside me, and they weren't going to leave. I don't know how long I was lying on that table, staring at the ceiling, feeling those things crawl deeper and deeper inside me. Time didn't mean anything anymore. The world outside that cold, concrete room felt like a distant memory, like something that had happened to someone else. I was trapped in my own body, a prisoner in flesh that didn't belong to me anymore. But then, something shifted. It started small, a subtle change in the rhythm of my heartbeat, or at least what I thought was my heartbeat. It was irregular, thumping in strange patterns, like something was pulsing in time with it. My head was pounding, the pressure behind my eyes unbearable. The worms, the things inside me, were moving faster now, more deliberate. I could feel them burrowing deeper, spreading like vines through my chest, wrapping around my lungs, my heart, my spine. My body wasn't just twitching anymore, it was convulsing. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone. I could barely breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed from the inside, ribs bending, cracking. The pain was unbearable, but worse than the pain was the loss. Every minute, every second, I could feel more of myself slipping away. Memories, emotions, my mind. They were being drained, eaten away by whatever was taking over. And then, I blacked out again. When I came to, I wasn't on the table anymore. I was standing. But not me. Not the me that I remembered. I was in the same room, but the air felt different. Thicker, colder. I looked down at my hands, but they didn't feel like my hands anymore. The skin was pale, almost grey, and under it I could see them, those dark, pulsing shapes moving just beneath the surface, like parasites swimming through my veins. I tried to flex my fingers, but the movement wasn't mine. My body was moving on its own, slow and deliberate, like I was a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I wanted to panic, wanted to scream, but I felt nothing. Just a cold emptiness, like someone had hollowed me out from the inside. My heart wasn't racing anymore. I wasn't sweating. I wasn't scared. The fear, the panic, the desperation, it was gone. There was just nothing. I was empty. I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned, my body turning smoothly, almost mechanically, to see them. The people from my apartment, the ones with the black eyes. There were more of them now, at least 5 or 6, all standing in a line, their faces expressionless, their eyes like endless voids. They weren't wearing masks anymore, and their clothes looked even more ragged, filthy, like they hadn't been washed in years. But there was something different about them too, something I hadn't noticed before. They weren't human. Not anymore. Their skin was stretched too tight over their bones, pale and thin, and their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they were being pulled by something else. They didn't have to say anything. I already knew what they were. I knew what I was. One of them stepped forward and I saw it clearly. It wasn't even trying to hide anymore. The skin around its mouth was cracked and dry, and something was moving underneath it, something squirming and writhing. Its lips parted, and I saw them. The worms. The same things that were inside me. They wriggled just beneath its gums, black and slick, crawling up into its eyes, making them pulse and shift. "We knew you'd come around," it said, its voice raspy, distorted, like it was speaking through a throat full of gravel. "You were chosen. We've been watching you since the beginning." I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth didn't move. My body was still frozen, locked in place. My mind was screaming, but it was like I was separated from myself, trapped in a glass box, forced to watch as my body moved without me. "You're one of us now," the figure whispered. "A vessel. The transformation is almost complete." I didn't understand. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic, no reason. This wasn't some experiment. This wasn't about selling blood or money or desperation. This was something older, something that had been in motion long before I got involved. I was never meant to survive. My body started to move on its own again, stepping forward, joining the others in the line. I was one of them now. I could feel the worms, our worms, moving in unison, connecting us, linking us together. We weren't individuals anymore. We were a hive, a collective. And there was nothing left of me, nothing left of the person I used to be, except for one last horrifying thought. What happens next? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The figures around me began to move, turning and shuffling toward the door at the far end of the room. My body followed, my feet moving without my consent. As we stepped into the hallway, I could hear it. This low, constant hum, like a swarm of insects buzzing in the distance. It filled the air, vibrating through my bones. I wasn't in a basement anymore. This place, wherever it was, stretched out for miles, tunnels and corridors winding in every direction. It was cold, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and made you numb. And then I saw them. People, dozens of them, all walking in lines, moving in the same slow, deliberate way. Their faces were blank, their eyes black like mine, like they weren't even aware of what was happening to them. Some were strapped to gurneys, others were walking in groups, but they all had one thing in common. They were all changing, like me. The humming grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just the sound of movement. It was coming from inside us. The worms, the parasites, they were connected, vibrating, pulsing in rhythm, creating that low hum that filled the air. It was the sound of life, of their life. And then I realized what was happening. They were spreading, through us, through the blood. We weren't just victims. We were hosts, vessels for something far older, far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. And we were multiplying, growing, waiting for the moment when we would be unleashed on the world.
I wasn't human anymore. I wasn't me. I was part of something bigger, something darker, something that was preparing to take over, to spread like a disease, like a virus, through the people of this world. The last of my humanity slipped away in that moment. The fear, the panic, the desperation, it was gone. I was empty, but I wasn't alone. And as we moved deeper into the tunnels, I realized there was no turning back. There was no escape. This was the end of who I had been. The person I used to be was dead, and whatever I had become, whatever we had become, was ready to spread.